Solomon and Smith. Welcome to Solomon and Smith. I'm Jack Truckenpedder. That is Milo Garner. Neither one of us is Solomon or Smith, but together we are Solomon and Smith. Lots of new viewers to the channel in the last few days. The Heart video doing very well by our standards. You're very welcome on board. As the title suggests, this is a list of our favourite works of fiction, decade by decade, from 1800 until the year 2000. The best 200 years there. We've limited ourselves to fiction, since otherwise the list would become sort of uncontrollably huge, and we'd be forced to make all sorts of completely absurd decisions like Schopenhauer or Dickens.
Encyclopedia Britannica is pretty good.
Yeah, yeah, the 80s Britannica is good, but do I like it as much as... In future, if you folks enjoy this video, we may do a video of our favourite works of non-fiction, which I think might even be able to go a bit further back than 1800, to say nothing of our favourite films decade by decade, which we're both kind of born to do, that kind of list. We could even do it year by year.
Yeah, that would be a hell of a list.
Or perhaps favourite poems. Pieces of music could also be good per decade. Again, that would have the issue of I could probably do that from the 1500s. We're up for doing this sort of thing if you folks like it. If you dislike this video, leave a comment with like a gnashing teeth little yellow circle man.
My list is 1800 to 2000 for the niceness of the blocks.
Yeah, a nice 200-year block. We are completely baffled by fiction that was published after the year 2000, meaningless. And before 1800, there are several books that are among my favourites ever, and it is kind of crushing to compile any list of my favourite books that does not include The Dream of the Red Chamber or Tristram Shandy. It's absurd not to include Cervantes and such things, but absurdity's the name of the game. The 1790s onwards, going back, that was sort of when it got really tricky for me, or there was like one book I'd read per decade, and I didn't like it when a book won just by default. We obviously have biases towards English language literature, and we have tastes in common. So there is a dangerous version of this video where decade by decade we pick exactly the same book.
We haven't compared notes at all. This is really it's a moment of revelation.
We are going to be shocked by each other, no doubt.
We're including short stories and novels. There's no hard and fast.
We're including short stories, novels, novellas. We're taking a fairly broad view of the categories defined by fiction. The majority of my list is novels, but short stories and short story collections are sort of permissible. Also, these are our favourite works of fiction. These are not the works I would select as the best works of fiction per decade, nor indeed the most influential or important. That would be a completely different list. These are just my own personal favourites, the novels and shorter works that have given me the most delight, that have made me laugh the most, that have remained a part of my personality, inextricably bound up with who I am.
And we're very arbitrary men. This is the problem. I hated all of these books last week, but I've kind of taken a shine to them now.
And before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and please consider supporting us over on Patreon. It helps us a lot to keep making these interviews on the main channel, and you do gain access to some exclusive content. Thank you. To prevent the video lasting the length of time itself, to prevent the video lasting 200 years, we will endeavour to race along and begin with the 1800s. What was your choice for the decade between 1800 and 1810, Milo?
So it is an incomplete novel, a novel no one bothered to finish. So clearly resented by its maker, named Heinrich von Ofterdingen by Novalis. who is or will be featured in an episode of this very podcast very soon. Would you like to reveal yours before we dig
No,
in to
go
the
on,
individual
dig
book?
in, dig in. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so it's what you might call a philosophical novel, which is to say a novel suffused with the philosophical idea more than necessarily an aim to please or to story tell or to get into some other district of art. With Novalis, who is a poet, who is a philosopher, who is a natural historian, one understands that a lot of his pursuits in fiction are not simply to chase some muse, but rather to express an idea that perhaps doesn't come across too well in technical philosophy. And so Heinrich von Ofterdingen is a tale of a would-be medieval poet sort of discovering his craft through this sort of dream journey in search of the blue flower, which is a somewhat ambiguous symbol, which may mean beauty, which may mean love, which may mean something harder to define. And we don't get the full journey because again, didn't bother to finish it. But we get, I think, the first two acts, as it were, of this story of a boy who leaves his hometown after having a strange dream that his father had had another very similar strange dream, and eventually meeting what appears to be the object of this dream, the blue flower, in a woman called Matilda. And then sort of that wraps up part one. Part two, Matilda seems to be gone. We're in a slightly more worrisome frame of mind. But the reason the book or the portion of the book is so impressive, it's just this extremely rich language. It's not one of those philosophical discussion books where it's a sort of stilted, very ideas first. Okay, I see what you mean, big metaphor, but don't get lost in it. Novalis has this very rich, very almost lurid language describing nature and mountains and undergrowth and overgrowth. And you get lost really in the poesy of it, the poetry of it. And the sense is that the philosophy is not despite his over-descriptive tendency, but because of it. That to actually find the idea, you have to get lost in this texture. So I think you could really, it might come off as a little unusual, but I think you could read it not really searching for any philosophy at all, not wanting to understand who this Novalis guy was or what he was trying to get across, but merely as an expression of just strange medieval fantasies of the dream of becoming a poet and what that could possibly mean.
Yeah, that's a great magical book. I mean, it's an amazing decade for German fiction. It's in some ways the high point of classical German fiction, that's sort of swallowing up Goethe's Wahlverwandtschaften, and my choice, Heinrich von Kleist's Michael Kohlhaas. The plot is a Brandenburg merchant on a journey towards a business trip towards Dresden, is stopped at a toll house. He has to pay sort of a surprise toll when he's crossing the border, and he also has to leave his horses there as a deposit. He tells the guys at the toll house, make sure you give these horses lots of land to roam in, because that's what they're used to. Gets to Dresden, meets a friend of his and says, it's strange that you have these toll guys on the border taking taxes. The friend reveals to Michael Kohlhaas, you have been scammed. Those men aren't actually there extracting taxes on behalf of Saxony. They are scammers. Michael Kohlhaas, on his return from Dresden, finds the sort of toll booth kind of inn where he was... where the taxes were unjustly extracted from him, and sees that his horses haven't been treated well. His horses haven't been left to graze in the field. They've been left in this horrible kind of small stall where the ground underfoot is uneven and they're meager and they're sort of diseased and in pain. And like Swift and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, it's one of the great texts of horse pain and horse suffering being the sort of inciting incident to something much bigger, something that seems to speak to the universal pain and universal injustice. Anyway, Michael Kohlhaas sort of sues these men who've scammed him, takes them to court in Dresden. But one of the defendants is related to the presiding judge, so injustice is carried over. The men are not prosecuted at all, and Michael Kohlhaas is also reprimanded by the judge for bringing this before the court. Michael Kohlhaas, in response, goes on an apocalyptic rampage of murder, arson, destruction, oblivion. He goes from town to town, raising militias, destroying lives, destroying whole communities, murdering the innocent until he sees justice. It's the greatest. It's one of the great works, along with sort of Bleak House and The Trial, of the miscarriage of justice, of what justice means, of the pursuit of justice. It was a huge influence on Franz Kafka, who wrote this to his first fiancée in a letter. "I didn't write to you last night because I spent so much time with Michael Kohlhaas. Do you know it? If not, don't read it. I'll read it to you," which I read in a single sitting, with the exception of a small portion I'd already read the day before yesterday, probably for the 10th time. It's a story I read with genuine terror before God. I cannot even think of it without tears of enthusiasm. Each wonder fills me with wonder at the next. Were it not for the weaker, somewhat crudely written ending, it would be perfect. That perfection which I prefer to claim does not exist, for even the greatest work of literature has a tale of humanity, which if you tug on it, begins to twitch, disturbing the sublimity and godlike quality of the whole. I quite like the ending, so it is a perfect, it is a perfect novel, and it's maybe more familiar to English readers through a wonderful rewrite of it by E.L. Doctorow, the novel Ragtime, where the sort of baseline plot and the way it evolves is mapped onto this black ragtime pianist, Kohlhaas Porter, who faces an injustice, sort of bringing along with it all kind of American racial injustice. It's set in sort of the Gilded Age. And Martin Luther, who's a character in the Kleist novel, is sort of taken up by Booker T. Washington, and Protestantism maps onto the Black Civil Rights movement in the States in the Doctorow novel, which is also wonderful. But yeah, that's my choice for the 1800s. Let's move on to the 1810s.
1810s. I think you take 1810s first. We can do a kind of seesaw.
I went with Frankenstein. It was looking at all the Jane Austen novels, going, you know, they're good. They are all about marriages and the forging of marriages. Frankenstein, on the other hand, crazy book. Crazy book. A volcano exploded in Indonesia, causing a preternaturally long winter over the summer of 1816. Sort of drove Europe mad in all sorts of interesting ways, got people writing all sorts of proto-sci-fi all over Europe. It's a really interesting phenomenon. This volcanic cloud floats overhead, changes the weather, and in the summer without any sun, with just constant rain and cold, the Sandman was written in Germany. Frankenstein was written in also in the German-speaking world, but in English by Mary Shelley. It comes from a dream. It was famously born of a ghost story writing competition, sort of suggested by Lord Byron, whereby the members of this small holidaying party in Switzerland, who couldn't really go outside because it was raining and cold all the time, decide to tell ghost stories to each other. Mary Shelley bases her ghost story on a really horrifying dream that she had, where a child of hers was laying prostrate on a bed. She described, it's like a son. My son was lying on a bed, and I looked into his eyes, and he had yellow eyes, and I realized I could not love him. This is then extrapolated out into the sort of, in a sense, one of the founding modern myths, one of the great myths of modernity, one of the great myths of the scientific revolution. like Faust, it is a story of a man becoming God or taking on too much power and not really moderating himself with the impulses of love and the sort of the fascinating chaos that comes from that. It's interesting, the narrative, the way Frankenstein is built as well. It's a story within a story within a story within a story at one point.
It's the structure is fascinating. The subject is fascinating. I think, perhaps a hot take given its sort of infinite life and constant appearance in large lists, that the actual writing itself is the weakest point. And there are some really hilarious contrivances, which I think you can take as endearing. But for
Yeah.
instance, the monster learning sort of perfect fluent English by the chance discovery of Milton's Paradise Lost, a
Yeah,
book of
yeah.
almost incalculable value, sort of in the woods. Well, here it is. I'll just get
Yeah.
through this and then get a kind of pretty profound. I like the idea that almost a full understanding of morality and sort of the heavens is actually within Paradise Lost as a single text.
Yeah, and there is a kind of adolescence to it that I do just find endearing. It feels like a dream. It's being carried away by subconscious forces. I think Shelley was never really capable of writing anything with as much extraordinary imaginative power since. I think she was 19 when it was finally published, 18 when the ghostwriting competition was initially proposed. Yeah, I do find it inexhaustible, not only to revisit, but also to think about. There are so many ways of reading Frankenstein, so many ways of talking about it that I find really rich.
Yeah, well, it's something reminds me of Philip K. Dick and the question, can a good or even great book be poorly written? Now, maybe Philip K. Dick is a more profound version of this, but a lot of
Hmm.
his prose, I think, is pretty shabby at
Yeah, yeah,
best. It's sort of, if this was not a super interesting book,
yeah.
it would be totally disposable, but it is.
Maybe the sci-fi genre in general. I mean, and in a sense, it's one of the ways that this list is more of my favorites than what I think is actually sort of more artful. I think Jane Austen immeasurably superior prose stylist to Mary Shelley, but I have to go with Mary Shelley. Just the imaginative power is extreme. It's profound. Yeah, it gives you more interesting dreams after reading it as well. Frankenstein. What was your 1810s?
So 1810s, like you, I was looking at all those Jane Austen books. You know, you've got your Sense and Sensibility, you've got your Pride and Prejudice, you got your Emma, your Persuasion, and I was thinking of the ones I've read, which is by far the greatest, which is obviously the sort of superior selection. I think the answer just came to me pretty directly as Persuasion. Now,
Mm.
Persuasion is also the only Jane Austen novel that I have read. Doesn't really have anything to necessarily disagree with that previous statement, but Persuasion is an interesting book, even independent of the Austen saga. It's her last book. Seems like a good place for me to come in as my first published posthumously. Not a book in which a great deal really happens. Now, while I haven't read other Austen novels, I am familiar with them. I have seen adaptations. I sort of know the stories and the intertwining sort of a sub-aristocracy doing their marriage games, as you say. But Persuasion is really a book where the drama has already happened. And there
Mm.
is a recapitulation of the drama. We do get it, but so briefly. It's in tiny exchanges. If you were to just create a collage of the Anne Wentworth interactions, it would be like less than a chapter. So
Yeah,
much is
yeah.
spent. They glanced at her across the room and then just the kind of flushing face that comes after that. And it's a really internal novel. And despite being pretty short, like it's in two volumes, but it really is a short book. I found it almost hard going just because it really is almost like the castle of Kafka, are really kind of like, can they not just talk to each other? But it creates this architecture of reality that says, no, they can't just talk to each other. There are so many reasons why that this simple interaction of two people who for I think 8 years or 10 years have been in love and have remained in love cannot even look at each other. And there's the famous line, something like, "We were worse than strangers. We could never be acquainted again," because of a broken betrothal was such that even to become friends from that level was impossible because there'd been an official splitting up. But it's also a great title for the book, Persuasion, because it makes you constantly think of the word. And this is something I've heard about Francis Ford Coppola. Whenever he directs a film, he picks one word that will be his watchword for the entire production. And if he ever has to make a decision, on a costume or a scene or a light, he just thinks about the word and sort of uses that as his compass.
Yeah.
Equally, I mean, Austen does it as well. Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma. You think about these
You think
these
about
words.
Emma, the entire
Yeah,
book. You think, Emma's still in it. Yeah.
so it's always relative to these, but persuasion being just this single concept, you're wondering who is being persuaded, what really is persuasion, from or to what. The word comes up a lot in the text, and every time it comes up, you think, hang on, pay attention to that. But it's an interesting device to turn the sort of the axis of your mind. But again, it's not a book of action. It's a book of thinking, a book of being in someone's head. For a bit, we're in Uppercross Grange. For a bit, we're in Bath. We are not the character to whom the most important things are happening. We're sort of in the corner watching a life apparently spent, a life apparently, well, I had my chance, didn't work out, and a life does not go on. Which means when you do get that eventual breaking of the shell towards the end, which is inevitable in a way, and maybe the sort of the greater later book would simply leave it unconsummated, leave it, it's a whole book of nothing happening. But Austen does weave it in quite a satisfactory way into consummation of this long-held love, that it does ultimately triumph. But the book isn't dependent on that success. The book is dependent on us feeling that time is gone, that romance persists but can be destroyed by the cynical world. And Austen's so good at writing a cynical character, not necessarily in a hateful way. We get these kind of cod aristocratic men, very pompous, marching around, wonderful to read, even if morally they're completely lost. But you sort of enjoy the pomposity of it all. But it's just wonderful to have a book where the marching band is over there and you're sort of looking at it and you know that it's meaningless. You know that the entire structure of society has pointed in the wrong way. And the book opens with the father explaining through the narrator that his favorite book is the Baronetage, just the big book that lists all the barons and baronets, and he can look in there and find his own entry and his own issue, and this is reality, to get into this little book. And Anne herself is like a weird footnote, because I think she had an elder or slightly younger brother who died, but either way, she's not an important one, and the entire book is written from almost that point of view of the importance of finding the good match. It's the marriage thing, right? Who ought to be married to whom, and why, and where. And then this other thing sort of grows out the undergrowth. But worth keeping in mind that it doesn't really defy that reality, because Captain Wentworth, who is the romantic ideal, he was originally rejected. Others persuaded Anne to reject him because he didn't have any position. He was just some sort of lowly naval man. You shouldn't waste it on this. Even if he's a good man, don't go for it. Whereas when Anne does ultimately go for it, he has actually proven himself. He's become a man of some title, some sort of a impressive naval rank. So she hasn't gone completely on the limb of romance. And I think, again, this is it's maybe a slightly more complex book than it seems. It's a book of no one doing something, then doing something. But there is a kind of critical viewpoint.
Let's go to the 1820s.
1820s, great. So for me, it is The Life and Opinions of the Tomcat, Murr, by E.T.A. Hoffmann. One of the automatically and obviously one of the greatest books ever written. Just the premise is the greatest book ever written. You don't even need to really read it. You just have to understand it exists and that it is in the world. So to take it very briefly, it is, as it is titled, a biography written by a rather pompous cat called Murr, who explains his life more or less from birth to old age as a kind of noble and well, it's meant to be a reflection of how you ought to live your life as a tomcat. And he speaks of his great deeds and the duels that he fought, the friendships he had with local poodles, the great romances of his life, living under the shadow of this fairly mediocre seeming composer called Johannes Kreisler. And that would already be one of the great books. Let's remember that alone. However, it has an ingenious frame narrative device, which is to say that the original biography of the Tomcat Murr was by mistake shredded by the cat in one of those scratchy things cats get into. Big mistake. So he had to rewrite the entire biography on what he considered to be blotting paper. On the other side of the blotting paper is the biography of the composer, Johannes Kreisler. So as you read the book, you get the reverse side where you're suddenly reading sort of fragmentary accounts about the composer himself who owns the cat before flipping back to the Tomcat Murr in his very sort of self-aggrandizing narrative. And in the composer, sort of, and this is a recurring character throughout Hoffmann, but in the composer's life, we get a sort of realist account of maybe a kind of social mediocrity who can't quite make it. But as soon as you get even vaguely allured by this narrative, you're flipped back into the fantastical and very well-written, highfalutin life of the cat, who is not so fond of the composer owner, doesn't really believe in this hierarchy. But need you say anything more than that?
It's one of the most insane, like, proto-Borgesian, proto-Nabokovian texts of the 19th century. I mean, it's really 150 years too early. So my 1820s, I'm a bit torn because this is one of the places where I felt like stretching the rules a little bit. So if we do limit ourselves to prose, my answer would be Stendhal's The Red and the Black, a great social resentment novel. But then I remember Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, which is it's in verse, but it is a novel in verse. And I'm very fond of Pushkin, but then I thought if I'm allowed to do a verse narrative, I'm just gonna go for what I really want, which is Byron's Don Juan. Fantastic, long poem, work of fiction. You know, it's in a sense it is larger than any sort of genre signification, any specific genre you could fit it into. If you're fitting it into the sort of genre of epic or mock epic, it's a little bit stranger than that. In some ways, it is to early 19th century romantic verse what Tristram Shandy is to the novel, and stern is the right comparison for Byron. Byron has a very strange reputation that doesn't match up with his writing well at all. Don Juan is this ostensibly the story of the sort of folk hero, the Don Juan, Don Giovanni in Mozart's opera, the serial womanizer. In Byron's telling of events, he's more of just sort of the victim of various women. But the story within the text is less important than Byron's voice, or the I voice, the narrative voice that keeps getting distracted from the story. And while he's telling it, just maybe a word, maybe a way someone acts, the way someone looks will remind him of something that happens in his own life. And the remainder of the canto will be taken up by this digression. Sometimes the digression digresses from itself, and you go 3 or 4 digressions deep. And like in Tristram Shandy, you completely lose the sort of narrative at the bottom. And the thing that's a joy about it is just this voice. It's such a fun, witty, irreverent, like dandyish voice. Think Oscar Wilde. And think Lawrence Stern. So inventive with the form. Percy Shelley said it carries with it at once the stamp of originality and the defiance of imitation. Nothing has ever been written like it in English, nor, if I may venture to prophecy, will there be, unless carrying upon it the mark of a secondary and borrowed light. You are building up a drama such as England has not yet seen. I could say very similar things about Pushkin. In some ways, Eugene Onegin reminds me of Don Juan, where it's less about the actual narrative you're reading and just how fun this narrator is to be around. He's such a witty, fun guy who's just doesn't care as much about the story as much as he cares about whatever happens to be in his mind at any moment. And some people find that kind of thing frustrating. I know loads of people find Byron and Stern and even Cervantes at times just unbearably frustrating, the way they get carried away. But I relish it. I love it. And great fun. Byron, too much talked about, too little read. We could move on to the 1830s now. I went with Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Very nearly chose a Balzac novel. I'm kind of sad that no Balzac novel is on my list, but Balzac's one of these authors who I think the cumulative effect is more impressive than any individual novel, as impressive as Père Goriot is, published in the 1830s. The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, again, has something rather adolescent about it, like Frankenstein. Maybe the prose style leaves a lot to be desired, but there's something unprecedentedly hysterical and bizarre and dreamlike about it in a way that I just love. I don't think Poe wrote anything better. And, you know, I do still love his short stories, despite them having something that maybe appeals more to adolescents than it does to grown men. The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym is essentially just a sea voyage book. It's kind of episodic. There's no grand overarching plot. These episodes are told with a kind of feverish intensity and real horror. I think the very first sort of story we get in the book is a time when the narrator found himself locked in a shipping crate overnight, being buried alive, and the visceral horror of an eternity of consciousness in the dark is summoned up with a kind of, I mean, just a really eerie vividness. The main thing that sticks with me about it and all these years, and the reason that I put it on there, is basically the last third, where it becomes a sort of forged travel log about a trip to the South Pole at the time undiscovered. The boat that Arthur Gordon Pym sails on goes to the very edge of the universe, or the edge of the world, where the world sort of scoops around and becomes a hollow earth, and the sea gets sort of milky white and warm as he approaches it. And the novel ends with this sort of this astonishing, dreamlike fantasy sequence of riding the boat into the edge of the world, the edge of the universe, and going inside the world and then stopping there. It just has an extraordinary power to it. Yeah, a wonderful book. Borges, he said, like, even later in life when he, said lots of Poe lost its charm for him, this is one that left its sort of magic claws indented in his skull forever, and it's done the same with me.
Yeah, so my selection for that estimable decade, the 1830s, is a short story, also sort of a compromise, because it's a Gogol, and I was thinking, well, will it be this one, or will it be The Overcoat in the following decade? But instead I've gone for Nevsky Prospect in the 1830s, which is a fairly straightforward, kind of divaricated story about almost two possibilities of life, two possibilities of literature, almost like the fork in the road for Russian literature in general. Is it going to be romantic, or is it going to be realist? And it's quite a nice forebear, because I think a lot of Russian literature following it decided, let's just do both at once. Dostoevsky seems like the great example of the guy who simultaneously writes the realist and the romantic, or the realist and the existential. He doesn't need to separate them out. So the premise is relatively simple. We're on Nevsky Prospect, sort of famously busy street in Russia, very well known, almost like how you describe Piccadilly Circus, just as an idiom, a byword, Nevsky Prospect. And we have these two men and these two women, both of whom are spotted on the street and immediately sort of fallen in love with, or rather desired. And our first man is sort of the artistic temperament, and he sees this woman and he follows her along the street, and they find themselves in a brothel. He's shocked and appalled by the fact that this great beauty can be associated with this great sort of slum reality. So runs away, escapes, but has some interesting dreams in which he returns to her and falls in love, and there is something truly important and magical and beautiful, despite the fact, the darkness of the brothel, in the brightness of this woman. So he awakens, returns to the brothel, and proposes to marry this woman. The dream having infected his brain, he believes, no, this is reality. There is a greater truth than what seems to be so dingy. And perhaps, as one would expect, she laughs at him, laughs in his face, won't buy that for a second. All right, fair enough. So the man goes home and kills himself. This is the romantic vision of reality, which is sort of interwoven with a certain realism, but also its heightened feelings, heightened emotions. Dreams twine in with reality, and the ultimate act must be taken. The other guy who sees another woman on Nevsky Prospect follows her. Turns out she's married to a tinsmith. Maybe it's a German guy. You know, the sort of men you meet in the street, and he attempts to seduce her, and then is caught by the man, and then decides, okay, I'm going to go back there and show him what for, and we'll do something. And perhaps it's not romantic, but at the very least it's honorable or noble. But is plied with various baked goods and decides, oh, I don't need to do that. I'm okay. I got my fill. Everything's fine. So instead of the sort of heroic duel or self-murder, he simply sort of goes about with his day, with his life. And this is two visions of romance on the same street, two potentials of how one can interpret the world. And I think it's a wonderful thing to have in one story under one voice, two completely different, almost attitudes to fiction cohabiting. And I like the geographic thing, and I like the witness on the street, following the person where they may take you, and then be sort of strewn along. And it's a very short story. You can read it, probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but it does contain these competing worlds. And I like it also just as the forebear. This will be the kind of sketch outline of the Russian literature. And I think my next pick, which we can now sort of leap directly into, is a sort of successor. And the next one from the 1840s is Mr. Prokharchin. I assume that's how it's pronounced, by Dostoevsky.
Prokharchin, yeah.
Prokharchin, yeah, which is a very early Dostoevsky short story. And while it is the only Dostoevsky on my list, it isn't his greatest or his best. But it does have a hell of a question sort of hanging over it. And the story is extremely simple. It's about this man who lives in a sort of corner. This is a classic of Russian literature, and I assume Russian existence. People living in divided sort of apartments in little corners of rooms, not even rooms, but a corner divided by a screen. And so we've got this man, he's a clerk, and he's got this sister-in-law who he has to sort of send 5 rubles a month. That's most of his outgoings. He doesn't get a dinner from his landlady. He gets half a dinner to save on the kopecks. He really, he doesn't lend out his teapot, even though he basically never drinks tea because he likes to save his coins. He is the ultimate miser, and doesn't really talk to anyone, keeps to himself. But he lives with various other people in this apartment who have their own corners. And at a certain point, they all decide they want to get to the bottom of this guy. They start to tease him. They start to sort of make things up that might threaten his livelihood, that future clerks will have to take a dancing exam. And if they are insufficiently good at dancing, then they may lose their jobs. All of this to sort of throw brainworms into this very conservative man with his funds who might fear losing it all. But that isn't the interesting thing about the story. The interesting thing about the story is after we go through all of this and we get one of those almost prototypical Dostoevsky dream sequences in which he's running out of this office building on fire, and there's all his fellow salarymen with their pockets jingling with rubles trying to save themselves until he's pointed out in the crowd and they all sort of swarm in to get him. That's in there. Still not the thing that makes it interesting. The thing that makes it interesting, in a way that reminds me almost of Mark Twain, is this man. He's a fairly old, shivering man. He dies, and after his death, they have a look in his mattress, and it's filled just with huge piles of silver coins, enormous wealth. Something like, it's 20,000 rubles. It's an absurd money from sort of Napoleonic era, from later, all different denominations. This was a very wealthy man who didn't spend any of his money and lived at the absolute minimum. And before his death, was terrified that he might lose his job, not today, not tomorrow, but the day after. And then what do we do? And Dostoevsky makes no attempt to answer the question as to why this man did not spend any of his vast reserves, why he was so terrified of life. He's just an extremely rich man who lived miserly and died. And we get characters like this in reality, with the Warren Buffetts of the world who still eat at McDonald's and have some old dinky car with billions in the bank. So it's an archetype worth looking at, but it's just a wonderful mystery to sketch out. And just in the last few pages, and just leave you with that.
Yeah, we get these sort of absurdist comedian Dostoevsky that we never really got developed later. There is another version of Dostoevsky's career where maybe he's not, sent to Siberia, where he fills his entire career with these, as you said, slightly more Mark Twain reminiscent absurdist comedies. Yeah.
And he is funny. I mean, I think
absolutely.
Now very, very famous, now sort of seen explicitly as a romantic story, White Nights, is hilarious. I think it's mostly funny, and it has a tragic and romantic bent to it, but I think people are misreading it a little bit, sort of weeping through the pages, doing this conveyor belt of the landlady trying to get her married, just a new man every day. It's funny, and it's meant to be funny, and I think, funnily enough, the Bresson film, and Bresson is almost never funny. Bresson is one of the least funny men ever to make a movie, but his film of that story, Four Nights of the Dreamer, is his funniest film. It's basically a romantic comedy. It does become brutally sad for a minute, but mostly it's hilarious.
Yeah, I my 1840s again. I was looking at a Balzac. I was looking at Cousin Bet, but I've gone with Wuthering Heights. Read it quite recently. Read it at 19. Thought, what is this garbage, trash, unreadable filth, lousiest canonical novel ever. I will never read it again. About a year ago, Anna picked it out of the library, said, I'm not enjoying this at all. I said, yeah, it's total garbage, trash, filth. Read the first page, weeping continuously the entire time. It's astonishing. It's one of the great English novels, totally original. It was too original for me at 19. I wasn't ready for what it was doing. No one was ready for this. It's kind of a sensibility that is ahead of its time. It's not formally ahead of its time or anything like that, but there's just something about the again, I'm going to use the word intensity. I've been using it a lot in my favorite books, but there's a really queer intensity in there that just doesn't leave you alone once it gets inside you. The contemporary reviews of the novel said, how could anyone write this without immediately committing suicide? As you must commit suicide on every page to be able to create something so perverse. It was really just unprecedentedly grim. It's the story sufficiently well known enough, but patriarchal head of an aristocratic family in the Yorkshire Dales on a trip to, I think it's Liverpool, picks up a sort of a dark-skinned street urchin who has been wandering the streets of Liverpool without any carers and takes him home and raises him like a son. The actual sons of the rich man resent this little dark-skinned boy being raised around them. They horribly, sadistically bully him for his entire childhood. And the rest of the story is this boy, Heathcliff, growing up, becoming a gentleman, and extracting really merciless, sadistic revenge on the people. You know, extremely grim frame setting, but with a really disarming tenderness as well, and sweetness, and really beautiful descriptions of love. Great horror scenes. The opening dream sequence where the guy hears the tap on the window and goes out to see what it is, and then a cold child's hand grabs him. Just brilliant horror. And the cumulative effect is one of like a real encounter with the supernatural. The supernature has a kind of realism to it I find really moving, and then it has just this gorgeous final paragraph. And when you read this in the context of what you've read before, it's just, for me, it's one of the most powerful experiences in reading. I mean, Emily Brontë, in a sense, not particularly well adjusted or a good fit for the novel as a form. I mean, it's a novel that resembles poetry in lots of sequences more than it resembles a novel. I'll just read this final paragraph. I lingered round them, under that benign sky, watched the moths fluttering among the heath and harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass, and wondered how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth. Yes, gorgeous, wonderful novel. All 19-year-olds are wrong about it. Go on.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one also because it is so much a novel of two parts. Yeah. And many people who even sort of profess a love of it, they really love the first half, and almost every film adaptation ends at the end of the first half. And I would agree insofar as the first half, in terms of just prose style and structure, is stronger. But without the second half of the inferior, it's more repetitive. It's got a strange back-forth geography. Yeah. You're in this house, you're in this house. Fine. But without that second half, even in it being slightly weird and clumpy, the first half is so much worse. The second half gives the first half this greater meaning. It sort of gives it this reverberation. It isn't just a sort of sordid love story, which it's a good version of that if you want it to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But if it ends at the end of volume 1, it's gothic and it's horrible and it's sort of rich and erotic. But with the second half, it sort of redounds across the generations. It becomes this sort of curse. It becomes this sort of infinite Heathcliff. But then Heathcliff redeemed not in himself, but in the issue, in the second sort of generation, who don't seem much like real people in themselves, but are kind of embodied. And I like the notion that Kathy doesn't look anything like Kathy Juan.
Yeah,
which no film has ever managed it because she has the same eyes. Hard to do it in a movie version. But it's just really putting it on again and again, but they don't look the same. It's not like Heathcliff seeing her in a younger form, which is, that can be moving in its own way. It's almost like more like him, more like someone else, more like her father back in the rich house. I just think it's a really interesting situation in which the book, in its flaws, is improved. And maybe this is a Frankenstein thing. It's like, it's not perfect. It's gnarled. It's rotten. It's weirdly kind of tangled. You don't look at Wuthering Heights and think, what a beautifully constructed book.
In some way, it feels like it's better than its author can write. That it's tapping into something richer than any conscious novelistic display of brilliance. But speaking of conscious novelistic displays of brilliance, my choice for the 1850s, I went with David Copperfield. My favourite Dickens novel, I think it's Dickens' his absolute best. Second half is significantly weaker, especially the final kind of quarter has some of the most disgusting plotting in Dickens' career, of horrible, disgusting plotting. Just the most unlikely or awkward, ham-fisted ways of making the characters move in the way he wants to make them move. But the opening section, the opening quarter on childhood alone would make it, for me, the greatest Dickens novel. I think it's the greatest single work from a child's point of view, captures this strange, particular, heightened, deluded child's view on the world with unbelievable vividness. All the things that are wonderful about Dickens are played up to their most. All the things that are most compromised and most, naff about Dickens are at the absolute lowest. And it's just so touching as well. It's an extremely moving book. I don't know whether it's a result of it being autobiographical, but there's something about the social justice, the pity, the charity sentiment in David Copperfield, which at times can be maybe unendurably saccharine in other Dickens novels. Here it hits extremely hard. Little Copperfield working in the boot blacker's factory, and going, on when he's at the end of his shift to go and buy a pint in these places on the Strand. I just, you read them once, they're in your head for life. You don't forget any of these sequences. You don't forget any of these characters or images. Dickens, when he wants to make you see something, you really see it. I love the sections as a young man as well. It's probably Dickens' most realistic account of what it's like to actually kind of have a job. He's maybe it's the fact that Dickens couldn't imagine having any job other than writer, and having a main character who's a writer. It's the only thing he could ever realistically imagine anyone doing with their lives. I really like the first marriage. I think it's really endearing, really sweet. Sort of premonitions of George Eliot in the writing up of a realistic marriage, a realistic sort of fraught love story. And it's everything wonderful about Dickens, and I think it's him at his finest. Yeah. What did you go with?
Yeah, so my pick, 1850s, is a novel called The Whale by Herman Melville, known by other names in other countries, but published in the United Kingdom as The Whale. And really, it's the memory of reading it, perhaps, is what gives it that greatness. Because entering The Whale, I had certain preconceptions about what it's about, what happens. It has a sort of a totemic presence in my life, in cultural life. You know about Ahab, you know about white whales, you've heard Ishmael's name, you know all of these guys. And when the book begins, it lulls you into a fairly preordained outline of how they're all going to interact, because it is exactly as you expected it to be. You're in, I think, Nantucket, and people are walking around finding their little rooms to sleep in, getting ready for the voyage. It is the beginning of a book, and you're reading the beginning of the book thinking, well, the book is going to continue as it begins, and this would be wonderful. Yeah. What a great beginning. I'm excited. Let's get our bag
excited
on
for a normal novel.
Yeah, what an adventure. It's not like sort of boringly normal, it's excitedly normal. It's like this is wonderfully done. Then we get on board, and then suddenly your brain explodes continuously, almost every chapter. Yeah, a friend of mine at work had started reading it recently, again falling into the trap, and was unfortunately quite disappointed with the fact it was not a normal book, and taken unawares by it. But this is part of its real strength. I think it is just because of its weird cultural presence. It does ambush you. And so you think you're reading a novel, then you're reading a sort of cod Shakespearean play, and then you're reading an instruction manual on how to hunt sperm whales and their particular anatomy, and whether a whale is or is not a fish. And then you are getting a pretty detailed, exciting description of a hunt of sperm whales, and the exact process of winching them up and removing their sort of ambergris and their other interesting fluid materials. And you do, at the heart of it, have this sort of thrilling and engaging story of vengeance. You do have the white whale thing, but you're in a kaleidoscope of styles and genres, and it doesn't really feel like this book should have emerged from its author in its period on its subject. None of these things necessarily imply, at least from my perspective at the time, this radical breakdown of narrative form. And a real interest in whales. I don't want to sort of undermine the whale factor as its title. It really is a book that cares about whaling and these people
Yeah.
that do it and the exact natural processes involved in that. It really it's a
Some would
what a
say too
book.
much, but
Oh.
and some of those descriptions of them beheading whales are genuinely like horrifying. It's a great
Yeah.
environmental novel in those sorts of sequences.
Yeah, and that period, it's a good one, sort of defining, well, how does all this sort of oil lamp economy come from? How does the modern world exist? Well, it
Yeah.
exists from like infinite whale slaughter, the blood of all of these, pretty intelligent creatures being slaughtered on the waves comes home and enables this kind of
Yeah.
new oil industry to come up, and it's so much more than that. Just it's like
Hmm.
being hit with a hammer, whale-shaped hammer
Yeah.
again and again.
Should we go 1860s?
1860s. So 1860s, I can't get around it. I'm afraid it's just there. It's enormous. It fell upon me once. I've never been able to get out from under it. It is War and Peace
Snap.
by our friend Tolstoy. There we go.
Snap.
It had to happen. It had to
Oh
happen.
crap. But it's a good one to do it on. Yeah, couldn't do it. Inspired by Dickens, Tolstoy made the final 100 pages or so really lousy to to sort of prevent these sorts of situations happening. So you have an excuse not to pick it for the 1860s, but he didn't do it well enough. Not
No,
lousy
yeah.
enough.
And there's something in the lousiness that is almost good. You feel as if you shouldn't be satisfied by this happy family sitting at the table at the end, that something has gone wrong, and that you're
Hmm.
left kind of musing. And of course, there's also all of the deterministic great man of history theory stuff, which I think I'm less opposed to than you. You see it as a stain. It's like Mona Lisa, but with like a massive stain
Yeah,
just in the
yeah,
middle
yeah.
of
It's
it.
damage. It's like
Yeah.
historical damage. It's Tolstoy deliberately damaged his own work.
Whereas I was fond enough of it on the first reading. I enjoyed sort of leaping out from the people and going into the mechanics of the universe and sort of saying, okay, this is how it appears to have happened, but let me tell you all that it's all just cogs in the great machine of life. Napoleon is just a man. Napoleon is not the god on earth, which you may, even in the structure of the book, be mistaken into thinking. But it's just the passages are so beautiful constantly
Mm,
throughout. It's just sort of because people see it and they are maybe rightly intimidated because it is genuinely
large.
enormous book, but it's just enormous. It's not actually, I would say, difficult.
Mm,
It's just constant events, constant reflections. When you do get several pages on a tree, which is always the famous and incorrect accusation against Tolkien that he just keeps spending
yeah.
pages and he doesn't do that. Tolstoy does do it at one very famous moment, but you don't want it to stop. When
No.
you leave the tree, go, but hang on, I think there's still
No,
a
that's
bit
that.
on the
It's sort
tree.
of the effect of War and Peace in general. You're crushed every time a scene ends because it's the single greatest scene you've ever read. It's a novel that tries to do everything, accomplishes everything. It's a romance. It's one of the great romances in literature. It's one of the great war novels. The war bits are like genuinely like white
Yeah,
knuckled rides, horrifying, extremely like invigorating adventure. You get like the great sort of social climbing novel. You get the great like political novel in there. It's just so good at everything it does. Really godlike ability to get into the subjectivities of every single character. It's
yeah.
like,
The
okay,
prince looking at the sky, that
yeah,
scene, just
that whole
staring at the
sequence.
infinite blue.
Yeah, yeah. No, the end of part one, like with the Battle of Austerlitz, like it has to pay off somehow because it's Austerlitz. But paying it off the way he does, you're like, holy moly! This guy, you're a 16-year-old girl, and it's like you just forget you're not a 16-year-old girl while you're reading it, and then you're a 70-year-old old like wizened general, and you forget you're not a 70-year-old wizened general while reading it. One of the great, revenge stories in there as well. Forgot to mention that's in there. It's so good. It's so good. I have a real fear that the 1870s we have chosen the same obvious choice. Can you confirm or deny that it is an obvious choice? Look, the 1860s and 70s, it's like this is the best novels ever were. These are the two great decades. We have so when like I proposed this idea to Milo, his first thing was like, can I really justify not picking Middlemarch? And the answer is yes, you can. We have both picked Middlemarch.
We have done that, yeah.
It's in some ways, like Tolstoy is in some ways a very equivalent kind of writer to George Eliot, at least in this ability to go into different people's subjectivity in order to tell a story from multiple different perspectives with extremely uncanny brilliance. But Middlemarch, I suppose, it's the local version of it. Of War and Peace is this grand continent-spanning epic and of great men and small men and everything in between. And Middlemarch is the quiet, small, rural version of the same thing. It's this kaleidoscope of human life. Every character is kind of unforgettable, with the exception of Will Cavendish, but we won't hold that against George Eliot. Every plot line is still in me so deeply, and it's about 6 or 7 years ago I read it, but with a prompt, someone going, "Oh, remember the bit where Fred borrows the money for the horse," and like immediately it's all in there. The whole emotional experience is so vividly portrayed. And again, like in Tolstoy, all these people at different stages of life with different priorities, different concerns, different emotional experiences, different levels of education, all portrayed with such extraordinary vividness.
And for me, it's Eliot's greatest quality in this book is depicting what I call these axial points. Just these sudden points where time seems to freeze, and this is the most important choice this character will ever make, or it is the most important incident the character will ever make. And I think I recall there's a scene where Fred is about to start gambling again when he sees Lydgate at the table but doesn't. Huge moment. Yeah. Or the point where Bulstrode is considering, is he going to, allow this man to drink alcohol or is he not? Very minor scene in its own sort of position, but this is the moral decision of Bulstrode's life. This is his entire worthiness has been pinpointed into this one yes or no decision. Or sort of Casaubon, his final scene on the bench.
Yeah,
Dorothea sort of building up the courage to speak to him, and then it's almost constantly you get these scenes punctuated. And when we talk about Dostoevsky having sort of fairly normal sort of melodramas, then punctuated by these insane, hallucinogenic, massive dream sequences. Eliot finds a similar, if not greater effect, but all of her hallucinogenic dream sequences are just ordinary decisions, but rendered with such sort of cumulative weight that you can feel it. You can feel the whole importance of the universe weighing on what are often actually pretty simple. And, you feel like maybe it's recoverable, but it isn't. This will be the ultimate decision of this character and sort of lead them to one way or another in their life going forward. And to just somehow dig that out, because if you describe the story of Middlemarch to anyone, they might think, oh, it's like a social realist novel about great Reform Act era England. Well, that sounds all right. It's hard from a synopsis to express that it's the greatest novel ever written. It just doesn't really work. It's like, there's this guy who's got this newspaper and there's a new doctor comes to town.
And the doctor marries the wrong woman. Our other characters. It's two, like, in a sense, it's two people who marry the wrong person.
Who may be ideal together.
Yeah, we've got two people who would be ideal for each other, who marry the wrong person. They never end up together. And
something great about it is it was originally at least conceived as two novels, which Eliot just thought, actually, let's mash them together, which sounds like something that would feel bitty and broken, but instead it's as though she had these two novels that in fact slot perfectly together,
Yeah,
were destined to
and
be together.
like the Nevsky Prospect, they both fill each other's negative space. Yeah, and just all the side characters. That whole sequence where Featherstone's making his will would be the best short story in English.
Oh, and the decision finding the codicil.
Yeah.
The decision, it's another one. They just sort of shoot into the brain. I mean, a lot of these books I've spoken about, I remember, some I've read like over a decade ago, and I remember them in especially The Whale in broad strokes, and I remember particular parts. But scenes like this don't stick quite the same. It's more about the idea of it and the grand structure and the form. But with Middlemarch, it really is just honing into these very particular moments from which the entire story radiates out.
Yeah. Another one of the novels with an almost unbearably perfect final paragraph. Won't read it out.
Yeah.
Go read Middlemarch. What do you Yeah. Right, I've lost track whose turn it is next. Do you fancy doing the 1880s first?
Yeah, I could. Yeah, 1880s. There was a couple of collisions. For this one, I've picked a relatively recent read, but it just keeps sort of playing on my brain stems, and that's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I think we can count that as fiction. I think it's
Just
definitely
about,
yeah, it's playing at reality, but never quite reaches there. A sort of godlike prophet climbing mountains, descending mountains, climbing mountains again, talking to animals, talking to a wizard who might be Wagner, suddenly bursting into lyric poetry, declaring frequently the death of God, but being quite pleased about it. It just has a sort of electric in it that zips out of the pages. And having since read other Nietzsche books, some of which indulging in more fiction than others, it's electrifying in a way the others aren't, because it is yes saying, it is yay saying, it is not nay saying, it's just such positivity erupts, and erupts is the word. It is volcanic. It feels volcanic, like you are in the funnel of the volcano being sort of rained on by a very pleasant smelling lava. It's just joyous in a way, and fine. Whenever Nietzsche even mentions a woman, it instantly becomes sort of like sludge. He doesn't even have interesting misogyny. Fine, okay, hands up. Like many of these others, it does have some flaws, but when he gets into that ecstatic run, when he's really just leaping in it, it feels like a world absent of all metaphysics is nonetheless the most important thing ever. It feels like life can, should, and must run itself infinitely in a loop because of sheer sort of joy and energy within it. And of course, the book is about me. If it wasn't about me, I'd feel really bad, because I'd be one of those sort of other men, the last men. But because it's a book written about me, it's just, yeah, it's like a trampoline.
I was squinting long and hard at the Brothers Karamazov for the 1880s, and indeed Huckleberry Finn, a novel I have a lot of love for. But I decided to go with the only choice I could really make, which is Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat, to say nothing of the dog. What started as, I think, a sort of almost encyclopedia entry style text on a certain section of the Thames River and its history, Jerome K. Jerome started filling with little jokes. He started interweaving the history of the River Thames, little article thing that he was writing, with jokes. Eventually these jokes started swallowing up the entirety of the article, and he just continued like that, and we have this sort of little mini encyclopedia of little funny great comedy vignettes of a sort of a very eventless boating holiday on the Thames in the sort of twilight of the British Empire. And there's just something so kind of sunny about it. I know the way a lot of people maybe feel about P.G. Wodehouse, this world of constant sunshine and humour. Every subclause is at least a little bit funny, beautiful comic writing. But I wouldn't. The reason I would put it on here is just there's also this strange little melancholy edge, which I find extremely endearing. Maybe it's the kind of melancholy that comes of an excess of sweetness, the melancholy of maybe a Mozart opera, where on the surface level everything's tutti hooty and hilarious and absurd and quite sweet and cute, but there's a strange mourning for that, a strange sense of loss, of impending loss that saturates the novel. I'm not sure if I could prove it's there in the text, but I feel there's this really sad, beautiful twilight feeling for it. I feel it's a great novel for just all these little unremembered moments of our lives that aren't particularly important, but which are pretty funny. I just should emphasize it's just a great laugh. It's just great jokes, front to back. There's a beautiful sequence where they're trying to open a tin of pineapples. The final few sentences of which are just some of my favorite moments of English prose. Just great comic writing, and Brothers Karamazov's probably better, but I'm taking Three Men in a Boat. A joy, a delight. I'll go to the 1890s. I chose Chekhov's most famous story, The Lady with the Dog, The Lady with the Little Dog, The Lady with the Lap Dog. How will they translate it next? Again, you can read it in 30, 40 minutes. We have a sort of old, disgruntled, world-weary, cynical man falling in love with a married woman. Very little really happens. It doesn't really start anywhere or go anywhere. It's just so extraordinarily well written, and I could honestly have chosen any Chekhov short story for the 1890s. To be honest, Chekhov may be actually my favorite writer. There's this masterful touch, a great eye for detail, the things that are picked up on, and really wonderful at just describing or making human emotion present in a day-to-day context, kind of equivalent to George Eliot, where there's an intense feeling of rapture, of importance, but in the way that you feel it in day-to-day life and about normal day-to-day situations. Nabokov said of the story that all the traditional rules have been broken in this little short story. No problem in the story. There's no regular climax. There's no point even, really, at the end. And it's one of the greatest stories ever written. Extremely moving. One of the most moving things I've ever read. I'll hand it over to you. 1890s.
Great. So 1890s, I think this is one of the books that maybe is constantly rewritten, but I'd love to read a sort of a contemporary version of it because it so richly captures its time and its particular district. And this is George Gissing's New Grub Street, which is sort of like a encyclopedia of what it was like trying to publish a book in and around the 1890s, and just what a terrible time it was as a writer with talent. Meanwhile, the talentless writer, the hack, self-promoting, becomes extremely successful and famous, and that's sort of outwardly what we're doing. And we get into
time ever to publish a novel. It will never get worse than that. The 1890s.
That's it. Yeah,
that's the low.
God.
You can't imagine a less literate society than that.
Yeah, it just didn't work. You had to publish these massive 3-volume things. Sometimes you had a 2-volume idea, but you couldn't get it published. And it gets really quite in depth into just how publication functioned, the sort of characters you would meet, the kind of systems you'd have to buy into. And while maybe some people aren't particularly interested in how this subscription system where you needed a 3-volume book and it would be sent to all of these people on a list worked, it is this interesting sense of the mechanisms of art, of how you actually get anything anywhere, and how the art form is shaped so much by everything else. Fine, that's a book about books, but equally it's a book about men or about people, how people are shaped by these structures. And it's a great book on sort of the moral person being a result, not necessarily of some inherent goodness or evil, but of their circumstances, not necessarily in a purely
Specifically
relativistic sense.
income. Specifically
Yeah.
income, yeah. Like money genuinely makes you a better person. Lack of money genuinely makes you a worse person.
And we can imagine these people, or indeed we see them with more or less behaving very differently. And I would argue equally there are probably some people who with money are evil and without are strangely penitent and good. But the overall curve of the story is as you say, how really not just success, not just fame, but even your status as a moral agent is completely globbed onto just whether you can make money from this thing, whether you can make money in any way. And the book is constantly in the shadow of genuine poverty, of that especially sort of late Victorian version, which was probably some of the worst poverty London had known for a while, not because previously was much better, but because it was this new form of industrial slum that the world hadn't really known on this scale before necessarily. And I think, people, even decades later, they look at Edwardian London as this kind of nice sunset of the British Empire, British ideal. But there were slums in London. People had to stay up at night to make sure rats didn't eat their babies. Genuine insight. And so Gissing gives you a little bit of this version. I think there's a bit in Brighton, a bit in London. It's all over the place.
Mostly in London,
Yeah, it's a really sort of rich realist story. And Gissing's life was relatively similar to this one. He made some very unwise marriage decisions, and despite even now he's sort of, people know about him, but he's not.
He's very rarely read, and it's a shame.
Yeah.
I mean, New Grub Street is the best novel I've ever read about the relationship between money and art. I think I've never read a novel that gets the psychological problems that come between needing money and wanting to make art in any other medium. Yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And the great character of Jasper Milvain, the great cynic, who just is completely happy writing like valueless slop for money, and just has a big grin on his face the entire time. And you also feel quite warm towards Jasper. You don't resent him for this amorality. If anything, it's quite pleasant when he's back on stage, because the writer's block sections with the sort of artist with dignity in poverty are just so hard to read. Yeah,
but it's also a nice sort of meta statement, because of course New Grub Street exists and is not a Milvain style of novel. So even being so aware of this, the Gissing himself is going to continue his journey into the abyss.
It has one of the great fake novels within a novel. There's a character who's writing this novel that's going to be so realistic, like that it will just map perfectly onto real life, and it's about like a grocer. It's called Mr. Bailey Grocer, and it's about the normal day in, day out existence of Mr. Bailey the grocer. And it's written by the only sort of character with complete artistic dignity in the entire novel, who's just happy being in poverty and just wants to. Yeah. Anyway, what did you get for the 19 aughts?
19 aughts. This could be an overlap, might not be an overlap, but the Man Who Was Thursday.
Snap, yeah.
It's one of the greatest novels ever written, so you've got to throw it in there.
Yeah,
and people don't know it is. People don't. This is the problem.
Yeah. Could I read a quote from a guy called Adam Gopnik? The Man Who Was Thursday is one of the hidden hinges of 20th century writing, the place where, before our eyes, the nonsense fantastical tradition of Lewis, Carroll, and Edward Lear pivots and becomes the nightmare fantastical tradition of Kafka and Borges. It is also, along with Chesterton's Napoleon of Notting Hill, the nearest thing he wrote to a masterpiece. I'd say it edges over the border and becomes masterpiece. I think it's total joy. Comic ecstasy. Really funny, really wild. A great philosophical novel in a sense as well, by a guy who doesn't really know what he believes yet. In our discussion with Hart, this is one of the main virtues of Man Who Was Thursday in relation to Chesterton's oeuvre taken as a whole is that there's this great searching quality to it, which is maybe there less presently in.
And a great mystery as well with this figure of Sunday who just expands and expands, both literally and metaphorically. I always see him as Orson Welles. Can't get that out of me. Just the late, large Orson Welles. And I think like the final chapter and the final paragraphs of that book are really bizarre. And I mean, there's kind of a Christian ethos of a sort in there. There's that whole section in France, I think, with the lantern and the cross. So we can't say it's completely bonkers, no foundations anywhere. But equally, I don't really know what it means. And this is part of the reason I like it. And I think later Chesterton,
he makes very sure you know what his book means.
Exactly. Whereas this one, especially, I mean, you know more what it means at the beginning than the end. You have a sense, like at the time, anarchy was a big kind of a fear factor in Edwardian Britain. Wasn't really a thing, but imagine that kind of bomb with the fuse and it's round and you throw it at people. That was on the minds of everyone. So that's the premise of the book, is undercover man trying to break into this anarchist group to figure out who's throwing all these orb-like bombs, only to find that every other member of the anarchist syndicate is also an undercover police officer, all kind of zoning in towards this one
it's
mysterious man.
It's almost like that idea is so funny that he gave up the story that meant anything in order to pursue it to its illogical or translogical conclusions. Yeah, because at the start you get this, pure Chesterton great little discussion where there's a guy going, every time I'm on the tube and the stations follow in the classical order, like Embankment and Charing Cross, I feel like a stab of pain. Why can't the stations just be randomized? Why can't all existence be randomized? Every moment follows on the next and is a complete surprise. And then there's a retort that, no, every time that things happen in an ordered way, it should be a bugle of victory for the forces of reason against the chaotic cosmos. So we start with this baseline and then it gets carried away with itself. And maybe like Wuthering Heights, like Frankenstein, I feel it's a bit better than Chesterton can write. It transcends his capacities and just and goes into this vanishing point of logic.
Yeah, I mean, just a joy as well. Not a particularly
so
long
fun.
book.
Yeah.
I feel like seen by some as a kind of miscellaneous work. Oh yeah, that Man Who Was Thursday. Think not taken too seriously. I think take it seriously, not to excavate it, but this is a seriously good novel.
Yeah. 1910s. I went with Of Human Bondage.
Which that was on my shortlist, but it's not my selection.
Okay.
But it's
I'm
hell of a book.
glad to hear it. Yeah, of Human Bondage, Somerset Maugham, great autobiographical novel. What's it about? Man makes it. It's just the guy's life. I don't know.
A guy's life who has every job in society. So it becomes like a cross section of England.
It's true, yeah, and again, just written with it's very, very important, kind of like Copperfield was to Dickens, especially compared to the rest of Maugham, who I also love. I think Maugham is very underread. There's lots of kind of guys floating around this time who I feel are very underread nowadays. He was a huge success in his own time, but of Human Bondage is an autobiographical novel where he changed certain facts about himself. Somerset Maugham had a lisp. In the novel, the lisp becomes a clubfoot. Somerset Maugham, I think, he eventually became a writer. Our protagonist eventually becomes a doctor, but they occupy sort of the same places in the life. It's one of these, like David Copperfield, an autobiography written at a slight angle, and it kind of like these just strangely powerful little social realist episodes. Very vivid description of someone losing their faith. For example, like probably the best description I've ever read of someone ceasing to believe in God in a novel. Really great descriptions of failure, of disappointment. Sort of the central drama of the book is a sort of a catastrophic kind of obsessive relationship where he, you know, masochistically follows around this sort of comically evil woman, played marvelously by Bette Davis. Great casting in the 1930s film. But I think the things that I find most touching about it are just the very, you know, in a sense, on the nose attempts to answer the meaning of life. The whole novel's kind of running through a meaning of life question. What is all of this about? What are all of these experiences about? I went to art school. I learned how to draw a hand. Now I no longer want to be an artist, but I still know how to draw a hand. I'm lonely in London. What is experience about? And I think it answers it in a way that is relatively satisfying. I think with the entire world is meaningless. You know, it's a nihilistic
Granted.
novel. Yeah, but it, I don't know. It has this beautiful sincerity to it. I think you know, this is a time when saying the universe is meaningless isn't really a gesture. This is someone who really arrives at this through all of this panoply of lived experiences. And I just think on a sentence by sentence level, it's just really great prose, really well written, and yeah, very touching. I love it a lot.
Yeah. And I think, just to continue what you're saying into my choice, there is a reason that authors in this kind of decade or so are often forgotten, is the sort of birth of modernism towards the end of this decade. You get your D.H. Lawrence, your Virginia Woolf, and they sort of sweep it. And then suddenly there's this weird, it's not quite Victorian, feels a bit old fashioned compared to these guys. And I guess has been swamped over, because one of my choices for the 1910s, which I didn't end up going with, would have been The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford, which is one of those very early kind of leaps into, I guess, formal modernism, which when put alongside On Human Bondage, which comes from maybe even the same year or a couple of years out,
Yeah, I think it's the
just
same
seems
year.
to come from a different universe of literature, and I suppose more exciting, at least for decades before ours. But what I ended up going for is a short story by Kafka, The Great Wall of China.
I very nearly chose that as well. Thank God we both.
Yeah. But what a great, I mean, there's not even necessarily that much to say about it. It's just a fantastic idea, which is not only a sort of discussion on, you know, why was the Great Wall of China built in the way it was, not in a kind of straight line, but piecemeal across its entire length, but also the relationship between the people building the Great Wall of China and the emperor in some distant, far-off imperial capital. And it's especially good. It's sort of modern communication sort of fuzzies it up a bit, but the sense of how can the emperor even talk to a man with his sort of shovel at the side of the wall? Well, he can't. The message takes such a long time to move from one place to the other, travels through such distant lands, is transformed by the travel and the time, that by the time it reaches the person it needs to reach, the world is different. It's reaching a different person, maybe even a different generation. And these two places, while they're in the same country, the same empire, doing the same thing, they're both building the wall. The wall is crucial. They're in different universes. And I think if you take it metaphorically, it does become this sort of wall, this blanket between any communication, that when the thought emerges, when it is delivered, where it arrives, these are not necessarily compatible places or states. But that's interesting. But I also just, maybe it's sort of the Orientalist that lives in my skull. But I love stories about distant lands where you have these great kind of untouchable heavenly emperors who try to talk to their distant, far-off kingdoms. And there's such a distance. And this quite short story really expresses the vastness of land, of people, how separate people can be, how different existences can sort of be Russian doled within each other to the point that there is no communication possible. And yet they are building together this big wall, and the wall is complete. We know that.
Right. The 20s may be the greatest decade in human art,
Big
in
decade.
all the arts, including literature. Yeah, what'd you go with?
So for 1920s, there was a lot of choice, but I decided for a few reasons to throw my lot in with The Sound and the Fury by old Faulkner, which was one of my first exposures to this kind of high modernism and an astounding way of writing characters, an astounding way of inhabiting characters. As we've been speaking about people like Eliot and as you mentioned with Dickens, the ability to sort of weave around all of these different personalities. But the way Faulkner does it is to kind of indent the text with their personalities, to sort of write through their mind. And the first section, it's split into four sections. We've got one from the character called Benji, one Quentin, one Jason. They're three brothers. Then the last one is not quite omniscient, but it's third person looking down on the characters. And Benji, the first character, he's sort of developmentally limited and as such can sort of receive information. We're in his memories, we're in his thought process. But when he contributes, it's in this very short, kind of staggered style. And I think his vocabulary is something like 500 words. People have sort of figured it out. So his personal vocab, 500 words, and then with more complex sort of grammatical sentences coming in from outside. And the whole becomes a mosaic, really, of these several viewpoints, these several characters. Each section, I think, takes place in one day, maybe not the last, but the first three. But it is of them reflecting on an incident in the past with their sister, Caddy, who it seems is impregnated by a local lout, ends up getting married and then left because he discovers that her baby was from before the marriage. And then these three characters, in their way, coming to terms with it and what exactly it does to the Compson family, who appear in a few different Faulkner novels. Absalom is sort of like a weird midquel in that it takes place in between all of the events with the character of Quentin. But it's just a really fascinating set of sentences that morph with each character. I mean, the third part is maybe the boldest. The first part you might think is bold because it's someone who can't really communicate properly in English. Fine.
The
But the
second
third
part,
part,
someone who can communicate a bit too much in English. And then
exactly.
the
Wow,
third,
Harvard brain. But the third part is a guy who's good enough at communicating. He's just not very interesting. He's just a bit of a bastard. And to be in the brain of a bastard and to not try and find in it a sudden depth or a well of meaning and not as the novelist is surely tempted to do, sympathize too much with them, but really give you insight into what a brain of a man is like who is just a bit evil, not in the sort of Dickensian sense of evil, but is just short-sighted, short-minded, will do things that are not beneficial. Quentin, part two, the Harvard-educated young man, is very misled, we can say. Those familiar with the book will understand. But he can express himself. You can understand him. You can understand he has this very shady, this very faceted character. But Jason of part three is just crude. But it's really amazing to maintain that crudity and then combine with these three narratives a combined understanding of the one history. And this Absalom, which would have been a selection in another world, but doesn't end up being one in I think the 1930s, is equally a novel really concerned with how do you construct the past from present brains and how is the past molded by present brains. And The Sound and the Fury, more than any other Faulkner book I've read, really lays that out. And in the fourth part, which is third person, so we're looking at it almost from Faulkner's point of view, or the historian or the author, we are then piecing these bits together. We're understanding the source, as it were, of each claim. We've seen inside their heads, and we understand the limitation of the form. And I think Faulkner really writes well about the limitations of writing, the limitations of accounts, eyewitness accounts or otherwise. So that's hell of a book.
yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the things that makes 1920s fiction so fascinating is this almost a rediscovery of subjectivity, a rediscovery of the kinds of ways of representing subjectivity. You get this sudden fascination with how can we really write thoughts that feel like thoughts the way we feel them? How can we portray thoughts as their and experiences and awareness, and the way it changes person to person? And my choice also does this all over it. Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is structurally incredible. I think most people, when you look at it from afar, the structure is the most magisterial thing about it. You get this holiday scene in the Isle of Skye in the first third, where we have various characters interacting with each other during a holiday on Skye, various families interacting, people of all sorts of different ages, all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different moral concerns, social concerns, emotional concerns, and we flip between their heads and their thought processes with this, just incredible grace. Really, really wonderful prose. As you were saying about Faulkner, just sentence after sentence is just staggering. Then a middle third where the novel is written from the point of view of time passing, and in brackets, most of the main characters die. Then the third section where we return to the Isle of Skye on another holiday being had in the future, and everyone's a little bit older. Everything's a little bit changed, and we flip between their heads after this time having passed section. Like many of the novels, poems, works of literature coming out at this time, it is coming to terms with the First World War, not merely the loss of actual life in it so much as the loss of a certain way of living, a certain unrecoverable innocence that the novel does a really great job of presenting in the first half. We have, without it being sugar-coated, it's not Hobbiton, the opening section of To the Lighthouse. We have people who are still striving, still broken and pompous and flawed and disappointed and all of these things. But this astonishing middle section, which really... it verges into prose poetry. It's like the language is almost Dantescan. Then the return in the third section, and everything feeling eerie, it feeling a bit like deja vu. We've been here before. We are in the same place. We know this place. We know these characters, but things are so unutterably different. And something so specific, such a sort of ambiguous, non-distinct mood is a thing it's incredible to be able to portray so vividly. Wonderful book. Wonderful final sentence. I have had my vision, which I read before having read the book. It was one of the first novels I ever read, actually, To the Lighthouse, which is quite strange. It's new in every different section of my life as well. I suppose there's more empathy for different older characters now than there was before, or there's different... I've met people who are like that guy or unlike that person, and it changes. Extremely rich, wonderful novel. My choice for the 1930s is relatively well known. You can't call him neglected because he has a Nobel Prize, but Elias Canetti's Die Blendung, which is in English translated as Auto de Fe. Maybe what you were saying, Milo, about the Jason section and the Sound and the Fury applies to the whole world that Die Blendung sets up. I don't like the title Auto de Fe. I think just call it The Blinding. I'm going to call it The Blinding from now on. The first English translator should just called it The Blinding. Blindness is such a great... stupid decision. You choose this Latin phrase over The Blinding... Anyway,
all fools.
And it portrays this world where kind of everyone is just completely insane and horrible. It's like this. It puts you in this universe of just of utter travesty, madness. It's a satire, It's this so everyone's a bit over the top. But it's kind of like it reminds me a little bit of The Simpsons if The Simpsons didn't feel warm towards its characters. Like it's this, good lord, what are these grotesque characters we have in society. So it's about an old sinologist, obsessive, planet-brained sinologist who just wants to work on sinology, has no idea how the rest of the world works. He somehow has an income through his family and through his inheritance, and is completely disinterested in the way the world works. He sort of, through a great comic series of misunderstandings, ends up marrying like his elderly maid, and this is the beginning of the sort of non-stop catastrophe that sort of befalls his life. And we follow him. It's like a picaresque tale going around this nameless city, bumping into grotesque characters. It's just so funny. It's so funny as well. It's like maybe the edge of where you can get to writing something like so. It's the horizon, the apex of discomfort and humor. Simultaneously. Elias Canetti's more famous for sort of being a social theorist, and the novel kind of comes from a similar part of the brain. It came to him after going on a trip to Berlin. I'm just going to read from this trip. This was in 1930, I believe, when he started writing it. What preoccupied me most after my return from Berlin, what wouldn't let me go, were the extreme and obsessive people I met there. One day the thought occurred to me that the world could no longer be portrayed as in earlier novels, from the writer's point of view, so to speak. The world had disintegrated, and only by having the courage to show it in its disintegration was it still possible to give a true impression of it. But that didn't mean one had to embark on a chaotic book in which nothing could be understood. On the contrary, one had to invent extreme individuals with the utmost consistency, just like those from which the world was composed. I realized that people speak to each other but don't understand each other, that their words are mere jabs that bounce off the words of others, that there is no greater illusion than the belief that language is a means of communication between people. Rarely does anything penetrate the other person's heart, and when it does, it's usually something wrong. It's not a novel of complete darkness and chaos and confusion. On the one hand, you've got the compensation that you and the narrator are having fun, sort of laughing at the vanity and the insanity of the average person on the street. And then at the end, there is this sort of redemptive, superhuman psychologist character who sort of saves the day, only for the day to explode horribly again at the end. But yeah, really sadly underread in English. It didn't get the distribution that it should have had in Germany either, because it was released in 1935 and he was a Jew. So it didn't, only after the war did it sort of circle around a bit. And by that time, Elias Canetti couldn't make a living as a novelist, which is a shame because he wrote the greatest German novel of the 20th century. It's really that good. This is really as good as reading gets. Read The Blinding, Die Blendung, Auto de Fe, Elias Canetti. It's so good. It will blow you backwards. It is so good. Anyway, over to you.
Over to me. So in your 1920s pick, you mention offhand that the Isle of Skye is not Hobbiton. Well, where are we going now? Straight to Hobbiton, baby. I'm perhaps controversially going to slot The Hobbit as my favorite 1930s novel, which feels wrong for a few reasons, but I think the most profound and pressing of these reasons is that The Hobbit does not really feel like a 1930s novel. I'm not sure where I'd put it. Really, I mean, Tolkien himself had something of a kind of Victorian sentiment to him, his writing, and to his character. Equally, The Hobbit in 1890 would seem completely out of place. I suppose The Hobbit could have been published in like 1983, quite harmlessly, but equally without The Hobbit existing, that would just be a complete nonsense. And Tolkien, despite being now one of the few authors who is actually read by men, and being sort of the byword for can you name an author before 1950? Well, I've got one. He is strange. for his period. He was doing something no one else was doing. He was clearly completely out of the literary streams of his time. Now, you can talk about his influences, which exist. He didn't invent it out of nothing. But he's a man who isn't a novelist, sort of coaxed into writing a novel by his children and those around him who think this would be a hell of a story. And he was previous to this a writer. We can't think that The Hobbit sprang out of nothing. He'd been writing his sort of myths ever since he was in the trenches as a young man. And this sort of notion of a great mythic Middle-earth style world had existed within him for a long, long while. And then indeed, the most complete version of what would be the Silmarillion, which I briefly toyed with being my 1970s pick, being again like, that's from the 70s. Okay. The most complete form of that came into being shortly after The Hobbit in the 30s, but never really caught necessary steam to be published at that time. But fine. So The Hobbit is an unusual book just for having no real precedence. It's an island in the middle of nowhere, suddenly and fascinatingly strange and different. But equally, it is a book composed of just great sentences, sentence after sentence that you want to read out loud. Indeed, it feels like an old oral tale because it's the best when read out loud. Compared to, say, The Lord of the Rings, which is a much more ambitious book, a book with more dimensions, but is awkward in places. And while there are great sentences, there are also plenty of disposable sentences. There's nothing in The Hobbit you want to dispose of. It almost belongs, if it belongs anywhere, to that canon of Edwardian children's literature. You know, The Wind in the Willows, Winnie the Pooh, Alice in Wonderland, one of these real bedside classics.
Winnie the Pooh is 1920s, but go on.
It's true, but sort of the same tradition, I would argue.
Yeah.
There was a time when the Brits were just writing amazing children's stories. Back to Beatrix Potter knocking about, Peter Pan also, it's just a rich.
And I think if you delete Lord of the Rings from your mind, you really like The Hobbit really fits snugly into that tradition. Yeah.
So it is that, but equally, and the thing that sort of leaks a sort of greatness into it is that it's one of these children's stories, but you can tell behind it is something so much larger. You can see just through the trees. Hang on, What's this thing? Don't mind that. We're going over this way.
Yeah.
But you feel genuinely, even if The Lord of the Rings didn't exist, that there is something over there.
You know Osgiliath is there.
You know it's there.
And that its author has named it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it has because there are many fantasy stories, especially of this ilk, even something like Peter Pan, that creates a sort of Neverland with people and princes and kings and places. But you also know very strongly in your heart, and this almost applies to C.S. Lewis, that the limits of the world are what you know. That maybe it implies there's more, but you know that's a literary device.
Yeah.
Whereas Tolkien, partially because he's working on a foundation he has built up, it really does feel like you are just getting a story within somewhere. And then The Lord of the Rings maybe jumps one frame back and you have a historical narrative. And then the Silmarillion materials jump another back and you have a sort of mythological narrative. But it's a sort of different lenses for the same invention. But I think in terms of literature, in terms of literary quality, The Hobbit is the only time that it was just sort of chapter for chapter. This is a classic. It's clearly a classic. Captain America was reading it before he went in ice. Crazy idea. People of the 30s know who Gandalf is. Adolf Hitler. Yeah, it was sort of like Gandalf in that book I read. What?
Yeah, that's not normal. Yeah. All these Victorians were walking around still alive and got to read the word Gandalf. What's your 1940s?
1940s. So I picked, I don't necessarily have a great deal to say about it, but The Plague by Albert Camus.
Yeah, good choice. Yeah.
Which I think is it's just a great book about a plague.
It's a really accurate representation of a plague.
Yeah, we're somewhere in North Africa, trapped in this town, and all the details are kept vague in a typical sort of literary manner. And we essentially get this new society born in this besieged town where no one can leave because of the quarantine.
Yeah.
And some people, they really flourish in this tiny kind of one-town universe.
I like the slow build of it. I like there's a few rats over there. Probably nothing.
And it has something of sort of Death in Venice, I guess, in it, but it's Death in Venice that isn't using the sort of plague as a literary device. That's actually the subject. It's not like, well, this is happening, but we're talking about sort of a kind of gay desire thing, pederasty. That's it. Really is about what if there was a town
Yeah, and there was a plague.
and there was a plague in the town.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like if the Magic Mountain was just about what it was like to have to
yeah.
have a cold.
But the great thing about plagues is they are existential. The metaphor doesn't need to be so deep because it really is, what if there was a society? How would it work? Well, there you go. I've written a book about a society, but limited it with this rather more sort of extreme variant of death, which exists anyway. Death exists.
Yeah.
Um,
Rather like in The Blinding, I feel like it's a novel that's impossible to read without the Third Reich in the back of your mind. Oh, everyone's got this mind virus suddenly in the German-speaking world. But and I think people feel very similarly about the plague. But with both works, I just really yeah, they're wonderful, just as surface level narratives on their own. It's yes. It's a very readable book, The Plague, very, yeah, just compelling on its own terms. And
yeah,
if it
fulfills
is
its
ever a
promise.
metaphor for something, that will come up incidentally. Yeah, it's. I also went with a French novel. Well, short children's book. The the second most printed book of the 20th century, apparently. Le Petit Prince, The Little
Hmm.
Prince. Like The Hobbit, I suppose it word perfect. I think the first draft was 60,000 words, then he got it down to 30,000 words, then he got it down to 15,000 words that we know, and every one of them was extremely well chosen. I've cleverly avoided pronouncing the author's name. I'll have a go. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Exupéry. I think it's Exupéry. I think you do it like that. Anyway, yeah, airplane man, airplane like aviation expert man driving airplanes around. You know, he escaped Vichy France to the United States. Felt kind of guilty about that. Felt guilty about not taking part in the war effort. And there's this extraordinary kind of melancholy, despair, grief going through him in the States, and writes this children's book, which is, on one level just full of just these wonderful absurdist satire vignettes. A man who has a lamplighter on a planet whose rotation is like 40 seconds, who spends his entire life turning the lamp on and off again, like an accountant man on a planet, counting every single star and saying that he owns every single one of them. It gets sadder and sadder the older you get, like all great children's literature. Irreconcilable about having grown up, really makes the grown-up world seem just completely gaga and cuckoo and crazy. And oh man, it's the saddest thing ever. The finale of The Little Prince is just the saddest, like maximum pathos, payoff, sadness thing ever committed to paper. It's so sad. I love it so much. It's sort of simultaneously very whimsical, playful, fun, brilliantly satirical, and just crushingly tragic. Exupéry, after its publication and colossal, enormous, immediate success, did go to France to fight, and kind of appropriately disappeared. No one ever found his body. He did a reconnaissance spy mission in a plane. At some point went missing. No one knows where he landed. Left the world. Left the book the world, the most perfect book that it contains. It will, it's like The Little Prince is just, it's the Song of Songs. It's Ecclesiastes. It's going to live forever. It's immortal. It's so.
And who did those really famous illustrations, which for me are just directly connected, but that equally good artwork?
Yeah, I can't remember his name. Some guy. And crucial
Great, love
illustration.
him.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
yeah.
really, yeah. The snake eating the elephant on the first page and it being a hat. Oh, yeah. Wonderful novel. Children's book. Yeah. My 1950s choice. Now, this is the golden age of American fiction here. This is insanely stacked in America. You got Lolita, you got Catcher in the Rye, you got The Adventures of Augie March, you got the recognitions, and now it's just not putting the recognitions on this list extremely hard for me. You know, there's Joyce, there's Nabokov, and there's Gaddis. There's like he's just absolutely supreme prose stylist. Superlatively wonderful sentences. Love the recognitions. But I didn't pick the recognitions. I picked The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. Half the viewers of this video wince with pain. This novel has a kind of really divides people. I kind of understand why. Really, I imagine if you read it with a certain background, a certain mood, there are several aspects of it that are kind of unbearably schmaltzy, saccharine, blunt, on the nose. Even the plot alone is kind of annoying. Man has affair with a friend's wife. Man dies. Wife prays that man comes back to life. God grants prayer. Woman therefore can no longer have sex with man, very slowly converts to one truth faith, Roman Catholicism. Man does not convert to Roman Catholicism, is left alone forever. I understand you hear this synopsis and this can only be junk garbage. And I am also in the position of really sympathizing with people when they crap on Graham Greene's other sort of serious novels. I think The Heart of the Matter and The Power and the Glory and Brighton Rock are all really flawed, really like choppy, scrappy books. But The End of the Affair is I think is wonderful. I think is just extremely moving. I think that the people who are also moved by this book don't really need to be explained why, and the people who strongly despise this book, they it's quite hard to articulate what it is about it that's so moving. I think Graham Greene's consistently writing wonderfully throughout it. It's the only one of Graham Greene's religious books that feels really sincere. It has some of that similar sincerity that I mentioned in Somerset Maugham of Human Bondage, but where Maugham sincerity leads him to a completely meaningless universe. Graham Greene's leads him to this aching, very erotically charged, very painful Catholicism. And it has the glorious thing of The Man Who Was Thursday, perhaps as well, of a man who hasn't quite figured out the internal conflicts within him. There is this extremely carnal side to Graham Greene. I think it has the romantic intensity of like the Chekhov Lady with the Little Dog. It really sounds like it makes you feel like you're in love from both perspectives as well. I mean, it's kind of interestingly structured. You get the two parts from the man's perspective mostly, and then you get the famous diary sequence in the third part from the woman. It's probably the most extraordinary part of the book, where we get her sort of slow conversion. And if it wasn't so well written and so psychologically acute and so kind of tender and beautiful, I understand the feelings people have about it. I understand the doubt about it, but I'm with it the whole way. I've never found anything as moving as The End of the Affair. I think it's the most moved I've ever been reading a book. Just kind of an incredible thing to say. It's Graham Greene of all men, the guy who wrote Our Man in Havana and The Third Man, like the fun spy novels guy. And it's been a long time since I've read it, so there is the possibility that I reread The End of the Affair this year. It's like a reverse Wuthering Heights. I'm like, yeah, no, it is the recognitions for the 50s, but that's not happened yet. So my choice for the 50s is The End of the Affair.
And mine, I mean, you mentioned that the 1950s for the American novel is sort of the ultimate dimension of novel writing, that it would be hard to even pick one of just the American novels. As such, I've picked a Greek novel, avoided the problem altogether. We're just gone way out there. The Greeks are writing novels, have been for a long time. And this will be by Kazantzakis, The Last Temptation of Christ. Probably better known for its Scorsese film, which is a good film, but I think the novel is a bit better. And it's about the humanity of Christ, which I think the further into theological or religious concerns you get, is the element of Jesus that is most lost. I think the bigger the theological construction, the harder it is to really see this guy as a guy and not part of various sort of triangle-shaped algorithms attempting to figure out the true nature of God or Christology or anything. And Kazantzakis, he has, we could say unorthodox, feels like exactly the wrong word to use, but he takes the Jesus myth and basically looks at it from a completely inverse angle. And there is, I imagine, a heresy attached to his particular vision of Jesus, and I don't think he is writing theology. So he views more as Jesus as a man who is being haunted, like sort of falcon's talons in his head, by something else within him, by something greater, and he cannot fully understand what it is. The God inside his brain, as if his head is going to explode. And so Kazantzakis essentially takes us through the ministry, takes us through the gospel up until the crucifixion in a slightly alternate fashion. And I think you can see his narrative is very much inspired by the historical Jesus. He doesn't give us all of the apostles with that very symbolic, significant number, but gives us the main named ones, assuming, well, those were probably the ones who were there. He builds out Judas in a major way, in that sort of popular Judas was a rebel. Judas was disappointed in Jesus for not being the radical who was promised. So we do get this historical, this novelistic vision of Jesus. But the great thing about the book is, of course, in the title. It's the reason that Milton's Paradise Regained doesn't really work. And in Milton's Paradise Regained, Jesus is tempted constantly by the devil, and in every single instance says, "No, I shall not be tempted." So by the fifth one, even though the devil's raising the stakes, you just know that he's going to say no, and he'll have a really clever reason for it, and there isn't drama. Maybe theologically, Paradise Regained is bold, but dramatically, it's a little inert. Last Temptation suggests something different. Jesus on the cross, fully crucifixed, about to fulfill the destiny of his reality, is offered by what seems to be an angel. We know is probably not an angel, a route off. He is told, you have been redeemed, you have been saved. You may come down from the cross and live life as an ordinary man. And so Jesus accepts the temptation. And we see this alternate history, as it were, of Jesus as an ordinary sort of Galilean dude, has a couple of wives, as was the fashion at the time, is a carpenter, and lives what you could describe as a good life. But then this sort of teeming disappointment, this feeling of betrayal, this feeling that he hasn't quite done the right thing. And the beauty, I think, of the book is it makes the image of Jesus on the cross not of one of supreme sorrow or misery, or how could you have done this to me, but rather one that Jesus has to will. Is that I have to be up there. So we get a version of reality where he's not up there. And by the end of his life, it sort of places it during the destruction of the temple, the big rebellion. He's filled with regret and sorrow that he isn't crucified. And so when we see him on the cross smiling, you believe it. You believe this is exactly what has to happen. And I think one of the great things about the book is the Judas-Jesus relationship, which in the Gospels is there's room to dream, there's room to imagine, kissing in the garden and so on. But in this novel, it becomes a very rich, and it's Judas who is least happy with Jesus not having died on the cross, because that was meant to be Jesus's mission, that was meant to be his sacrifice, and he has failed to do that, because in this version of it, Judas is in a way complicit with the mission. Judas has to give up Jesus in order to enable this prophecy, which no one really wants to come true, but has to come true. That's what he's been preaching. That's what the sort of God in his brain has been arguing. But he gets out of his destiny, and it's the worst possible thing. And I just think it's great to have a sort of religious fiction which doesn't feel too precious about theology, but equally doesn't feel like it's attacking the orthodox position. Doesn't feel like it's, well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Let's give you another version, which maybe if we see Master and Margarita and that wonderful,
I think that's also from the 50s,
that wonderful Jesus story in there, which is again very much inspired by the historical version. We won't use the kind of traditional names for all of these places. We will use sort of like, it's not Jesus, who is it? It's like Yeshua or something like this. They go for the archaic forms of names. But to do all that business, but not do it to kind of throw the gospel off, but in fact do it to understand it better, to try and see, fine, if we could tempt Jesus off the cross, he'd wish himself back up. Why on earth would he do that? Instead of just taking it as the line, like, well, look, because he's God, he has to do it. Can we give a human reason, that a human person, the humanity of Christ, why does the humanity of Christ want to be crucified? And I think Kazantzakis gives you a fantastic version. And his Paul is great. His Paul, who is in the film played by Harry Dean Stanton in a wonderfully American role, but his Paul in which Jesus is made into the Christ. And he's sort of, Paul is talking about Jesus in all these ways. He's as though he'd been there, which of course Paul's the kind of fake apostle, never met the guy. And I think I think maybe Peter's saying, you didn't know the guy. He wasn't really like this. And Paul says, well, that doesn't matter. Even if Jesus wasn't crucified, Christ was crucified. And that's what I'm talking about. And so I can see why some of the evangelicals really got het up about the book and indeed the film. But as ever, I think they maybe were missing the point.
Okay, let's go to the 1960s.
1960s. So I think the book I should have chosen, the book that is the true and honest answer, the greatest book of the 1960s is indeed Nabokov's Pale Fire. Didn't choose it, cannot account for it. I chose The Phantom Toll Booth. Any fans of The Phantom Toll Booth in the house by Norton Juster? In fact, the first book ever given to me at the time of my birth. It was a sort of gift of life. I think the inscription read something like, "Dear Milo, hoping you will never be bored," which is wonderfully touching for all who know me. And the book is about, indeed, a boy called Milo who is bored. And so in his boredom is spirited away into this land of sort of a paradox and idiom in which all things have their literal meanings. And it's just a massive web of word games and unexpected outcomes and sort of wizards on bridges asking you three questions. But when you get across one bridge, it's another wizard with another question, and on and on and on it goes. And it's just, and sort of, counting every grain of sand type scenarios. Everything has a wonderful name. It's kind of a book about maths. Not to put anyone off, but it's sort of, there's a lot of mathematical ideas in there.
Maths and numbers. There's like something of the Alice books and the Little Prince in it, actually.
Yeah, and it's in the 60s. It's way out from any of the classical children's book territory, and I think it maybe is somewhat underread by the children of the land. It's kind of known on certain areas of children are aware of it, but I don't think it's necessarily got the kind of absolute Winnie the Pooh classic status that perhaps it deserves. But maybe it's just a little too out there as well.
Yeah.
It's just really a joy, and I think now you don't have to be a child. I think it's a good adult book as well, because it is just so clever and winding in its various solutions to problems, and just always doing the opposite thing you expect.
Yeah, it's a fun book. I read it as a child. I think I was 11 or 12 or something. Yeah. My 60s one, my way of not picking Pale Fire was to choose a novel published in 1980. Great
move.
But its author died in 1969. His mother shipped it around, tried to get it published for about 10 years, was eventually
This is going to make my 80s choice really awkward, but do continue.
We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But I think it's a novel of the 60s. Everyone would agree. I think
it's got a bit of an 80s vibe to it.
I think only a dunce and dunderhead could possibly regard this as an 80s novel when its author never knew such things, never knew such dates. It's John Kennedy Toole's Confederacy of Dunces, the great sort of picaresque comedy novel of the 20th century. I think the 20th century is closest to like a truly original character creation of the sort of magnitude of Don Quixote. Ignatius, Riley, this sort of bloated 90% hot dog fat Boethius reading
valve-based
masturbating Thomas Aquinas figure, screaming in sustained wrath at the modern world, at modernity. Great screed against modernity, great completely mad modern world. Again, I'm thinking to The Simpsons, and I'm thinking to The Blinding. It's just wonderful little micro adventures and comic situations in the streets of New Orleans. And very moving. Like, it's strange how it gets moving. It's strange where the sadness creeps in, kind of hard to identify exactly, but it's there. Everyone kind of feels it. And it may be just knowing that its author commits suicide before he saw the immense sort of success and cult status of his novel. But it's... Yeah, and one of the really, really great tragicomedies. I think because it is so funny and silly, maybe doesn't have as a reputation as elevated as it deserves. I heard someone say it's the single greatest Thomas Pynchon novel, which I can get behind, and maybe in that respect is also. It is an 80s novel that just happens to have been written in the 1960s. It is maybe more relevant to a time that came after it, to our own time, actually. A world that's sort of so far away from the Platonic form of what it should be, so deeply enmeshed in perversity and slop and advertising and junk food and junk culture, that the only kind of really emotionally honest and spiritually honest reaction to it is a kind of belch. It's so funny. I love how popular it is as well. Everyone I give this book to as a recommendation loves it. I love that a book this weird has such a kind of broad appeal, which kind of shocks me a little bit, because there are various aspects of it, maybe the sheer amount of medieval theology in it that are a bit strange. But wonderfully written.
It's like Equus being a hit West End play.
Yeah, it's like that. It's the Equus
Naked
effect.
boys, dads, eyes out of multiple horses. Hundreds of thousands of people booked their tickets.
More. So I'll head on to the 1970s. I picked Iris Murdoch's The Sea. It's about a theatre director on a sort of prolonged holiday that promises to be the rest of his life in Cornwall. We get descriptions of him, making breakfast and going along the Cornish beach, looking for seals. We get lots of descriptions of the sea, in the sea, meeting the locals. Then he sees a dragon emerge from the sea. And this presages him sort of seeing his first crush, his first love in life, now as an older woman, as an older married woman, and the bulk of the plot is his obsession with this old love, his sort of climbing around in the bushes, stalking her, making like various really cringe-inducing social faux pas to try and be around her. But the reason this novel's on this list is just this spiritual dimension of it, which creeps along like a bit like quietly underneath it, with brief flashes of magic in like the appearance of a dragon or the appearance of a ghost, but then explodes in the final 150 pages or so when this character of James, the cousin, becomes much more prominent, and we have some of the most like orgiastic, sustained passages of rapturous, mystical prose in English, including possibly the most powerful ending I've ever read to a novel. Okay, it sort of does a fake out ending, and there's another little ending after that. But the people who've read it will know what I'm talking about. The dramatic climax of the novel, which somehow sort of to swallow the entire universe into it, stars behind stars behind stars, and to particularize them with this really unprecedented, like magical, visceral intensity emerging from what is kind of on a surface level a realist novel of kind of love and obsession. Love it. I love loads of Iris Murdoch novels. I think this is by far her best one. But people should read more Iris Murdoch nowadays. Yeah, dudes, all my men, go read some Iris Murdoch. Like George Eliot, one of the great women writers at writing men. What was yours for the 70s?
So it's a very manly writer.
Yeah.
And it's another one that seems sort of strangely out of time for a very good reason. So this is Cormac McCarthy's Suttree, which is maybe the most unlike the famous Cormac McCarthy books of those in the sort of canonical selection. It's not got cowboys in it. It's not got apocalypse in it. It's maybe a little bit of apocalypse, vaguely hinted, but it seems more in a world with a book like Confederacy of Dunces than with Blood Meridian or All the Pretty Horses, things like this. And it feels out of time, partially because it was written over 20 years, begun in 1959, published in 1979. So it started as, I think, his first novel. By the time it came out, 3 other novels had already preempted it. But it really encapsulates my weird feeling with McCarthy that I think all of his novels feel like they should have been published in the 60s and 70s. Whenever I sort of encounter his books and his style, it surprises me that his last novel came out in the 2020s. He has it feels so mid-century, mid to later mid-century, 20th century, and Suttree's particularly wonderful in this aspect because you can see the great influence of Faulkner still very much in its veins. You can see the style adapting because Suttree, to give a brief sort of synopsis, is like a picaresque. A man from a wealthy family is given it all up to live on, I think, the Tennessee River like a nobody and gets up to all kinds of adventures. But it's mostly the weird people he meets. And boy, are some of these people weird. The weirdest being this guy called Gene Harrogate, who has previously been arrested for fondling or sexually engaging with watermelons on a farmer's crop. And I believe our narrator is trying to help him out a little bit, but he gets up to all kinds of harebrained schemes. I think at one point he tries to sort of dig beneath the town to rob its bank in like a massive tunnel style situation, or he gets an idea to, I think, get a slingshot with poisoned meat and shoot it at bats.
This is already I've not read it.
To collect the bounty on these bats. And it is, there's definitely, I mean, it's kind of a river novel like some of the Twain stuff, but the language and the description is almost Faulknerian, although in a very comic phase here. And occasionally we get what McCarthy ends up doing later on is he has these wonderful extended passages where you just meet a really strange character and you sort of go into their head and you stay there for a while and then you come back out and you're back in the story. And even in this early phase, you get this. But it's sort of great to see this author who later becomes very distinguished by his own style, still kind of in the shell of someone else, still breaking out. But it is also just really funny, really entertaining. Really, you get these kind of grotesque figures running around, and beautifully written. I remember the first, it has this little prologue, and I remember reading it and feeling almost like I couldn't read the book because it used such a high amount of technical maritime language. It's like I can't read anymore. What do you mean? Never encountered any of these words for sails and hulls and sort of like different parts of a boat. Yeah, one after the other. But it's a very rich language, but not maybe as foreboding as later Cormac McCarthy, which I enjoy a lot, but none of it made it on the list. Perhaps there's a reason for that. But Suttree, for those who, you maybe have read The Road, Blood Meridian, some of this other stuff, give it a look. Fun times to be had. So we're now moving on to the rather awkward decade of the 1980s, and this it's a rather fun jaunt called Confederacy of Dunces, about a sort of valve-based organism who vacuums in various hot dogs while working as a hot dog man, therefore irritating his employer considerably because most of the stock is within his corpulent and large body. He is an expert in medieval theology, perhaps a genius, some might argue, has a notion of stoking a sort of labor revolution, which does not come to fruition.
All the social justice bits in it are so hilarious. I love the bit. There's a great. I think the sentence when I properly fell in love with it is quite early on when Ignatius is like watching some teen pop show. And you hear him from the next room scream the sentence, "Do I believe the perversity I am witnessing?" and I this sentence like has never left me. I walk around the average modern day city centre and it is applicable almost everything.
And it's a good book to sort of smell. It's got a kind of really disgusting grease to it, which you don't. It's sort of Naked Lunch-esque, but you don't get lost in all the strange words. But it's got a real texture to it.
Great word choices, like great inspired diction. Like corpulent is like a great example. Using that kind of word in the right context, just superb comic writing. I think that in the sense in American art, for both the kind of tone and the world it builds, The Simpsons is the thing that I think it's closest to in a sense.
But with
The Simpsons lacks the theology and everything.
And it's just more savage. But I think it's got a good plot as well. It's not one of those sort of like you're there for the vibes. It is actually very well constructed. It's not, because especially with the story of the mother gathering the sheets, you kind of imagine it to be a work of arrant genius, but doesn't necessarily fall together. But it's very well constructed novel.
This is what Walker Percy said, because the mom, she'd been bothering him for a year. She'd been like writing him a letter like every week for a year. And Walker Percy described himself. He's the guy who got the great novelist himself, the moviegoer, for example, got the novel published. And she eventually badgered her way into his office, and the manuscript was in his hands. He couldn't get out of reading it, and wanted to be able to just, within the first few pages, confirm that it was bad enough that he couldn't, in good conscience, publish it. And was just like, goes through this completely absurd experience where it's not only readable, it's not only good, it's extraordinarily good. How on earth is this the way good novels find their readership? I was just astonished by it, just on every level, sentence by sentence level, the technical mastery. the characters are all wonderful, not just Ignatius himself, who brings up so much of the space, but all of the, I'm sort of forgetting names, but like the janitor guy, wonderfully built like comic 3D character. Ignatius's Amor, the mom herself, there's a really great comic cast of characters. Yeah, wonderfully plotted. My 80s choice could have been any novel by Thomas Bernhard. This is Thomas Bernhard's golden era, especially the last 4 novels that were published. I've gone for the final one that was published, the first of the 4 last ones that were written, confusingly, Extinction. It's like all of Bernhardt's stories, a sort of in a kind of a tirade, a rant form. It's full of this slightly comic, overblown sense of righteous indignation, not necessarily a million miles away from the way Ignatius looks at the world, an over-the-top, hostile relationship to the world, and indeed not too far away from Michael Kohlhaas in Kleist, who was an enormous influence for Bernhardt going all the way back. I could really have chosen, any of these wonderful final novels, The Loser, Woodcutters, Old Masters, but I went with Extinction because, well, it's the biggest, it's the most ambitious, it's the one that takes on the most material. It's sort of, in a sense, 2 Bernhard novels glued next to each other. The first of which is a man looking at a photograph of his family who he's just been told have died, and him having no warm feelings whatsoever towards them. Looking at this photograph of them, full of just of a resentment, of a loathing, which for the first half of the novel feels like comically overblown. You understand where he's coming from, but it seems a bit overdone. The second novel becomes sort of a lot more narrative. We go through his experience of sort of the setup of the funeral, everything, him returning to this family estate, and gradually it becomes apparent that this that it is a novel about the Holocaust, and the resentment and the screaming and the tirade voice suddenly becomes just so much richer. Kind of like we were saying in Wuthering Heights, the first half becomes much richer in the context of the second half, where all of this stewing indignation is completely justified, and it doesn't balk a little bit, and just wonderful prose as well. It's, I think, Bernhard, I think, is the certainly in the German language, I think the best prose stylist since the Second World War. Wonderful novels. His novels are getting sort of a second wind at the moment. I know loads more people reading them. Do yourself a favor, go read them. He's wonderful, underappreciated, still a little bit, but get in there. Novelist. Sort of reinvented the novel in a sense to fit the sort of form, the kind of language, the kind of tone, the kind of energy he needed to implant into it. And speaking of reinventions of the novel, my choice for the 90s was something I read just a few months ago. I went with Vladimir Sharov's Before and During. I could have gone with The Rehearsals as well. Vladimir Sharov is a novel I just, basically for this show, read for the first time, an episode that's not yet uploaded, a conversation we had with Oliver Reddy, who's been translating his novels into English for the first time. He's sort of in a sense, Before and During is the last novel of the Soviet Union. It's written as the Soviet Union is crumbling around him, and it's a magical retelling of Russian history, and I suppose the history of communism, the history of the revolution, through a really sort of surprising mystical lens. It gives you a version of communism, a version of the 20th century that isn't this cold, historical, materialist, mechanical story of the triumph of a sort of mechanizing, rationalistic outlook on nature and the world and people, but coming from a strange, deeper messianic place. He construes the Russian Revolution as this sort of magical messianic quest to bring paradise to earth. In terms of formal characteristics of it, it's in like vignettes. It almost comes across as sort of a collection of short stories sort of glued together around our central sort of narrator who listens to people, who imbibes all these stories around him, some of which end up sort of swallowing the whole novel. He is probably most similar to someone like Murakami or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie, even the more widely read magic realist authors in English. But there's just something a bit crazier about this guy than those magical realists, sort of mainstream canonical authors. It's a guy grabbing you by the throat, telling you something very, very, very urgent that you have to listen to. You're not entirely sure where it's going, but it's constantly fascinating and just unutterably weird. You're constantly asking, like, where are we going? How did we get here? What is this driving towards? What sort of huge megalithic apex is all of this narrative energy sort of pushing towards? And I got completely drunk on this energy. I've read all of the ready translations of Sharov novels since. I think he's a wonderful, extremely underappreciated fiction writer who you should all go away and read.
So 1990s, coming to the end, but not quite, of our long journey. My selection was, naturally for some, irritatingly for others, Infinite Jest. The great book of longing, of desire, of direction, of what it really means to want anything or go anywhere or do anything. It has this existential sort of undercarriage built into it. The novel is named after a film or a supposed film that is so extraordinary that you want to do nothing else but watch it until you die. And that, as a metaphor, is strewn through the entire work of sort of drug or alcohol obsession and addiction, of competitive sports. And you get this huge array of interesting characters and histories that twizzle around each other, trying to answer some of these fairly central questions, and ultimately the book ends up looping around on itself. It's an enormous book, but it really does ask you to read it again immediately after finishing. I did not do this, but I did reread the first chapter, which feels necessary. It feels like the final chapter is, in fact, the first chapter in which everything makes sense. And there are lots of reasons we could go into Infinite Jest on its literary merit. But I think it's also just a fantastic example of what the kids like to call world building, of entering into this strange, slightly satirical version of the Earth and being given just piecemeal, by like little crumbs, senses of this much larger conspiracy, we have to call it, emerging at the edges. And equally, we meet artists, we meet filmmakers, we meet politicians, we meet tennis stars and players, and an entire world is populated bit by bit, and we encounter them from so many angles. There is something happening in Canada. There is something happening up there which is either concave or convex, and we do not immediately understand what the hell any of that means. But as the story moves forward, we become increasingly aware of the sort of Quebecois political situation and its various agents and actors, and the way that situation up there is affecting, our kid who's in tennis academy, and our various drug addicts here and there, and our sort of filmmaker whose various incredible sounding experimental films are listed in enormous footnotes. And of course, the book is very famous for its footnotes. I once met someone who read it ignoring the footnotes. There is an entire chapter in a footnote, but he just thought, well, it's a footnote. It's not that important. But this is a sort of structural game playing. And I suppose by the 90s, that's a little old-fashioned. Pale Fire, which neither of us selected from the 60s.
Despite it being
the obviously
best of all novels.
is doing this kind of thing a long time ago. But what Infinite Jest really nicely picks up on, and it was really a trend in American and I suppose British literature at the time, is that new, very branded world. And I suppose it picks up the torch laid down by Pynchon, laid down by Toole, of a sense of everything being recognizable through its brand name. So throughout the book, you won't encounter sort of random made up, but I know this thing, Coca-Cola, that. And for a while, this was big in American literature, but it's done maybe best in Infinite Jest, a world built of just brands and companies and identities. And
the years are named after companies. That everything becomes sort of advertising space, including
but not too self-aware. It's not sort of pointing at us going, do you get it? Do you get it yet? This is just how things are, and it's not that critical, at least of that element of it. And I suppose just when you dive into Infinite Jest, and often you spend quite a while in there, you come out with this whole other place just sort of throbbing in your brain, a little bit like a Middle-earth experience in its way, because it is just so detailed. And I think it was you who mentioned to me that the original draft was twice as long. But I think in losing half, you then have this shadow world of half the book that exists in David Foster Wallace's brain, but does not exist in the book. But we can kind of catch glimpses of it through this huge, structurally complex and also just very funny book. I think to talk about Infinite Jest, forgetting that it's funny. It's a funny time. You will laugh reading it, even if the ending is, I would say, quite moving throughout, often hysterical.
Yeah, I like the bit. My favorite parts of Infinite Jest are those that sort of verge into sort of essay territory. I think Wallace as an essayist is my favorite version of him, and the sections just in the rehab, in the AA meetings, where it's clearly just the guy writing about his own experience in AA meetings in that style, I just think wonderful. Yeah. I'm not there for all of it, but it is.
There's a lot there to chew on.
Yeah.
If you're one of our patrons over on Patreon, you gain access to a bonus decade where we talk about our two favorite works of fiction from the decade between the year 2000 and 2010.
That is everything. That is there's a reading list. It could be that you have read all the novels on here. It would be very interesting to collect these lists from other people as well. If you would like to be interviewed by us about your favorite works of fiction every decade going back, I think that could be quite a nice format, no?
And the other, your favorite sculpture from every decade of the Renaissance.
Exactly, but I think it's fun. I enjoyed making the list. It's nice. It's been nice while talking to realize all the strange similarities between all of my favorite books. Clearly, in the older books, we seem to be much more interested in the weird, the formally experimental, like it's a cat autobiography that's a composer autobiography, and in the mid-century, we're maybe more attracted to the non-modernist kind of straight, slightly old-school 19th century narrative fiction. One of the things I noticed. But we'd love to see your lists. I mean, you can email us. You can just write a comment below. But we'd love to talk to you about your list. What do you think of our lists? Don't be too harsh.
You love them, don't you? They're great lists. I think.
Yeah. The end of the affair over the recognitions. I have a feeling I'm going to look at that decision in my 40s and just scream in pain. Anyway, have a lovely rest of your day. Both you, Milo, and the viewer.
Yeah,
And
and I say the same. The viewer, you get 2. Jack, you
yeah,
get 1.
cheers. And keep it real, yeah?